We now move on to same issue, but our local board. And Greg and Sandra, the time is yours. Warm welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And can I also thank you for including the local board in the workshop that was held recently where this issue was discussed more informally. We were very grateful for the opportunity. We do wish to talk about the proposal for consultation on options to address flooding in Glen Esk Road. We are worried about some of the options that are being proposed. What is being suggested is a consultation, and consultations by definition should always be very careful events that do not raise expectations that cannot be met. To get slightly legal, there's a case involving the Court of Appeal back in 1991 and Wellington International Airport, where they gave a legal definition of what a good consultation was. And they said that it's not to be equated with negotiation. Consultation may occur without those being consulted agreeing with the outcome. It involves listening to what others have to say and considering their responses. Must be genuine and not a sham. There must be sufficient time for it to be allowed. The party obliged to consult must provide enough information to enable people being consulted to be adequately informed. Party obliged to consult must keep an open mind and be ready to change and even start afresh, although it's entitled to have a work plan already in its mind. And consultation is the statement of a proposal not yet fully decided upon. And to summarise, we should only consult on what we're prepared to do, and decision makers should then have an open mind about how to progress it from there. We are concerned because in this case there are a number of options which I can reasonably confidently say will not be accepted by council after it's gone through all the processes. The options concerning dams, for instance, and also the tunnel proposed through to the Wekatahi stream, they would run headlong into the Waitaku Ranges Heritage Area Act, as well as local opinions, and just raising them as proposals would result in major community backlash on them. And so we do think that you should think very carefully before even deciding to progress for those particular options. Just in terms of the finances, they are gold-plated responses to solutions which could be much more cheaply achieved. The other concern that we have is that not sufficient emphasis is being put onto restoring the environment. For particular, there are wetlands owned by council on Glen Esk Road that are somewhat affected, and if they were restored to their full ability, they could of themselves give beneficial effects for stormwater. And the other option which we think should be given more thought to is replanting. There are fairly significant green areas up the valley, and plants are one of the best means of dealing with stormwater and also have the obvious environmental beneficial effect. We're also worried about the 3-year timeline being given to assess change. We think that some of the solutions here may take much longer but may be more effective. And in conclusion, we do think that particular care needs to be given to considering what is being consulted upon, and it shouldn't be done in such a way that local concerns will be raised. I've hopefully get my comments very briefly. I wanted to allow Sandra the opportunity to talk as well.
I want to answer questions on your side of things so that we don't kind of conflate the two, and then Sandra, do you want to present and we can ask questions on yours, or do you want to both just do it and then we'll do a free for all?
Yes, both and then.
Both and then? Cool. Okay. Lovely.
So just to follow on from what Greg said, and these are my personal comments as Piha person and an elected representative. I just want to reinforce what Greg said about only consulting on what you're prepared to do. And it's hard to see how some of the options, in fact, a significant number of the options in here, would ever see the light of day. And several of them would be environmentally devastating. And when you put up such fanciful options, I wonder why the option of buying out landowners, which is not included, which I asked at the workshop would be included in the report, but that hasn't happened. And Greg's also mentioned other omitted options, more soft options that might not totally solve the problem, but could mitigate the effects of flooding. This report is a really full of harder engineering solutions, and I don't see any of the more modern, not necessarily solutions, but mitigation that could be put in place. Thanks, Greg. When consulting, as Greg said, you're required to give people sufficient information to make an intelligent and useful response, yet there's vital information left out of this report. For instance, there's no information about the current work on the public assets, such as Piha Mill Camp, Piha Domain Campground, the Nigel Hen and Hut camping area, and all our lessees and community assets which are on the domain or other public land, such as the Tennis Court Bowling Club and the gallery, so that the public is not getting the whole picture. But yet these are the sort of things, if you're going to consult, the residents of Piha would want to know how various options would impact on these community assets and on the public assets. There is absolutely widespread support at Piha for the continuation of camping at Piha, and yet in this report there's no information about how the various proposals would impact. I just want to particularly mention option 8 because it sounds like a bit of a soft option, but it isn't really. And what's not considered here is the impact on properties downstream of the Seaview Road Bridge. Widening and deepening the stream would increase the velocity and therefore the erosion on those properties downstream, most of which are built on old sand dunes. There's also no information on the impacts on property owners in Garden Road if a tunnel were to be drilled through the hill and the water discharged into the Wekatahi stream. That will affect a whole other group of people. If anything, and this is what really worries me, this proposal simply extends the number of residents anxious about the future of their properties. So it was fairly well restricted to people in Glen Esk Road. Now you've brought in people in Beach Valley Road, Marine Parade South, Garden Road. And I think the question which has recently arisen of who bears the cost, and the fact that a lot of these options look like it would be the community being asked to pay for it. A community of 900 people is not really spelled out. Just a final comment about the consultation. That case with Wellington Airport said that the consultative process must be genuine and not a sham, and I feel that this proposal has all the hallmarks of a sham. I really think that the committee needs to send this back to the officers and ask why it's consulting on this, and if it wants to consult, it should only consult on proposals that it would be prepared to carry out and prepared to fund. That's it, Madam Chair.
So thank you, Sandra. Now, there will be questions, I'm sure, and I'll just ask members, we do have the report next, so this is just questions of clarification from our 2 local board members, and then we can get into the substance of the debate. So, Councillor Cooper.
Thanks for input. One was a question for the local board through Greg, through the chair. In terms of, you talked about some of the options, are these the ones you said your board would not support? I mean, I know it's early days, but that was option 5 and 6 specifically. It's really helpful to us to know.
This is the dam and the tunnel.
Yes.
Yes, we just don't see how it can ever.
No, that's fine. I thought I've got that, but I just wanted to be really clear.
Yep.
And the other one to you, Sandra, was around when you say you'd like us to send the report back. I've got real concerns about how long this has taken already, and people waiting, and I'm sure Mrs. Kerrigan's insurance company are waiting to see what we're going to do. And my concern, and there's been criticism that we've taken so long, I guess I'm saying, are you comfortable if we take longer? That's my concern.
First of all, I'd just like to say that the board hasn't reached a view on what options it would not support. We haven't had a chance to have that discussion.
Oh, sorry, I thought Greg had responded as the chair.
I'm just amplifying on what Greg said. So as far as the time it's taken, I think that the council has mishandled this from beginning to end. And it is deeply regrettable that so much time has gone on to come to this place. I could expand on that. It should have got its peer reviews done earlier. It should have acted with more speed. But in the interest, yes, it's regrettable, and I certainly don't support time being dragged on, but I think it's an abuse of power to go out and consult on this particular process.
Sorry, I just don't understand when you say abuse of power. I think it's a bit...
It's the power of the council.
accusatory.
You know, I think it
stands as a comment on its own.
Yes.
I think we need to unpack it. No other questions. Councillor Dowd.
Sorry, thanks, Sandra. Hey, thanks, Greg. Look, very important issue. I'm just trying to grab why the council would not look at, it would just extinguish any option that it saw was an option, but it was not one that it could actually fund and deliver. Why would you extinguish an option only on the grounds that it was not within the parameters of Auckland Council to deliver? That just looks like it would be a failure of the Local Government Act test to ensure options were provided. I've seen lots of business cases where the options analysis goes beyond what can be funded and delivered, but you do need to do the options analysis, an honest and full one. So I'm just interested in why you suggest you shouldn't do that.
The dam proposal, for instance, is tens of millions of dollars to solve a problem where there are clearly much more efficient ways of dealing with that problem. And it will cause huge environmental distress, and locals would be up in arms about it. So even just raising it as a straw man argument, I think, would cause more damage than benefit. And same with the tunnel. The tunnel will bring in a whole new group of residents who would suddenly have major concerns for their neighbourhood. And so instead of dealing with a specific problem in one area, you would have a problem in two areas. So just in terms of the wanting to get a civilised outcome out of a consultation, putting these options in is going to make that much more difficult.
But also, I mean, it kind of will have the appearance of being completely ludicrous if the council has just spent something like 600,000 upgrading the Kirikiri Falls track, and that's seen as the sort of like one of the prime tracks with many tourism operators on it, 160,000 people a year on it, and it's proposed to put a dam on it. So I think you run the risk of the council of just not looking genuine about what you're doing if you go out with completely sort of wacky proposals like that. And I don't think it's doing the people at the other end, are they to treat it seriously? If they treat it seriously, as Greg said, then a whole lot of people will be concerned about a tunnel emerging in a road in a different catchment and all the water from that catchment, which we're told, and I'm sure Mr. McElroy will tell you, has this enormous, it is one of the steepest, if not the steepest, catchments in the Auckland region, and has this enormous amount of water coming down it, and we're now going to drill through a whole hillside and put it out into a different stream with other houses along the sides of it, or into the sea, and I'm sure the surface would be up in arms. So, you know, do you really want to disturb and upset a whole lot of people who will feel, because the council's put it out, they must take it seriously when there's no point?
Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask, you know, the Tonkin. I'll just put a lot of my. Oh yeah, okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask, you know, the Tonkin and Taylor report identified the bridges, right, as being unsafe, and one of them particularly dangerous. So don't you think it would have been irresponsible for council not to identify an option that addresses what was identified as dangerous? Or is it disingenuous that we're not even going to be able to afford to do that option? I'm trying to figure out.
Bridge itself, I think, does need to be part of the mix, and if it's dangerous, clearly it has to be strengthened. So no problem with that. We don't see that it's linked to some of the other proposals, though.
Thank you very much, Greg and Sandra. Look, as a personal view, I happen to agree with you that options probably 5, 6, 7 and 8 won't work. But when you get engineers that are asked to look at, well, how can you prevent this, wouldn't it be negligent of us not to put the options up, simply so they can be eliminated on financial and environmental grounds? And I think they will be. But not to have explored those options would have left the question hanging. Why didn't you look at how you might be able to prevent that? So if you're going to do the job thoroughly, don't you have to put all of the options up, even in the knowledge that, given local opinion and the Waitakere Rangers Act, that they're not likely to proceed? But at least you've been seen to look at them and therefore to have grounds to eliminate them. If you don't put them up, the question's left hanging. And, you know, I've had correspondence from various people that have suggested, you know, well, what the council should do is move the bulldozers in here or do the other. But, you know, if the engineers do the job thoroughly, we put the options up. If they don't make sense environmentally and financially, we rule them out. But at least we've considered them, because I think that's where this report is coming from.
In terms of your consultation, if there's even a remote possibility that you may decide a dam is the solution, then you should leave it in. If there is no way that it's going to be a decision at the end of the day, then I think it's actually safer for you to take it out, because otherwise the question of how open your mind is becomes an issue.
And can I just say, I don't think if you'd gone to the people at Piha and said, what kind of options would you like us to look at, anybody in their wildest dreams would have thought of building a dam up there. Actually, they did propose that in 1915 and decided it would be too costly for that water supply of Auckland. But, you know, and yet what's not in there is a sort of exploration of the soft options, even if they think they wouldn't work. So it's quite unbalanced in favour of very hard engineering options that are not affordable or certainly not desirable.
A good point to bring this to a conclusion, because that's exactly the debate that we need to have. Councillor Cooper will move, and I will second that we acknowledge our local board for their presentation on this. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. And thank you very much.
Madam Chair, could I seek your indulgence for a minute, because I meant to say something else, not about that, but you have on your agenda the Regional Pest Management Plan, adopting it, and I think the board, when it gets a chance to see this, will be really disappointed that the things that we put up have not really got any traction. And the one in particular I wanted to mention is about the boundary gorse rule, which we wanted reinstated from the Regional Pest Management Strategy. And I read this and it said it's going to be reinstated, and I got quite excited until it said only for properties involved in commercial primary production. So that discounts us out in the heritage area, where if you don't have a boundary rule, it means that the Transport Authority, the road owner, Auckland Transport, or whoever's doing it at that time, does not have to remove gorse from the road corridor. So I would really like perhaps the councillors to consider that boundary rule applies everywhere rather than just where there is primary production land.
The team are here, they'll be listening to that and we can pick that up when we get to the item. Thank you, thanks so much, really appreciate your time. Did we put the recommendation? Yes, we did. So let's move into our agenda as it is, and we move quite logically straight into our PHAR issue. So we'll hear the presentation all the way through and then take questions. So warm welcome, Craig and Paul and Kataraina.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, Paul Lloyd taka whenua. Obviously you know Craig and Caps, they probably don't need an introduction. So what I wanted to do was briefly just introduce the paper. And so the paper presents a series of options which would be a collective response to what we see in terms of the flood safety risk within PHAR. And so our approach to this has been to take a very broad and open mind to what might be possible in response to that flood safety risk. So we've been very careful to look at a full range of options, and that's really been on the basis that today what we want to do is make sure that we're presenting a full range of options, and in terms of the recommendations for this committee, it was to then engage with the community to help us work through the feasibility of those options. And that's really in recognition of the impact on that community and also the knowledge that rests within that community. So you'll see in the paper that there's 8 different options. They are framed really in terms of a series of options which are about keeping people away from floods. There's another series of options that look about our readiness and our response to the flooding situation. And then there's the other set, which are largely those heavy engineering options, which are about keeping floods away from people. So there's been some discussion about those engineering options. Those are in there because in terms of having the most effective response to mitigating that flood safety risk, those heavy engineering solutions deliver that. The downside and the trade-off of those options is that they're extremely costly, they have a pronounced environmental impact, but they do enhance the safety of the people in that community. So that is why they're in there. And in terms of the way the report is framed is we want to go out and talk to the community with an open mind. The community may well have some other options that we haven't considered. And in framing this, it's really been driven from the experiences of other local authorities. I had some experience myself in central government in response to the Canterbury earthquakes. And the approach there was really looking at, and this is about natural hazards, it has a pronounced impact on people. So our advice is really framed about, well, actually, how do we engage those affected people in the decision-making process? And how do we actually create that opportunity for them to shape the advice that comes back to council? So you'll note the report, we haven't highlighted any preferred options. The options are there and they will be subject to discussions with all the affected parties, from the local board to the community, to landowners and to the mana whenua within the region. And we will come back and we'll draw on that advice and come back to this committee in June with some advice. So that's into our next steps. So the look at the moment is very broad. Nothing has been ruled out of the table because drawing on some of that experience into Canterbury, it creates distrust if you remove options from the table and you don't take that opportunity to engage with the community. Happy to answer any questions.
So there's a very similar, or there is a process that the Ministry for the Environment has developed for coastal areas subject to inundation called dynamic adaptive pathways. Are you familiar with that process, and have you applied it to this particular instance?
Through the chair, I'm going to turn very quickly to Craig because that's getting into an area of technical knowledge.
Yes, I am familiar with that particular approach.
Are we effectively applying that through this process?
I think it's at this stage we are still working through what the options would be. And so we're still in and when we get through that consultation, they will be factors that will be taken into account.
Okay, well, I just make the observation that there are some processes that are very relevant that we could and should be using.
Thank you, Councillor. Any questions? Mr. Mann.
Just a couple of things out of the paper. In terms of option 1, you've got local responses to minimise the impact of storm events, and part of that is regulatory. And you've got there that council has included flood notations on land information memoranda for properties in the Glenesk Valley since 2000. And I just wanted to get some clarification of that because I'd had correspondence from the MP that said that nobody was aware that there was a flood risk. Can you spell out for us, I think there's 10 or 12 properties that are prone to regular flooding. Was that actually spelt out on the land information memoranda in each and every case, or wasn't it? I'm a little unsure given conflicting information that I've received.
I'm pretty sure there's a specific reference to this information in the Tonkin and Taylor report. So, without having time to go to the detail in the Tonkin Taylor report, what I can assure the council is that yes, the land information memorandum has included that knowledge of the flooding risk. What has occurred over time is that the understanding of that risk has increased over time, but certainly because this is in a rural area, it hadn't been subject to the same level of flood analysis that a normal urban area would have applied. But as soon as that information has been known, that information has been placed on the relevant property limbs.
The second question.
Through the chair, in addition to that, so on page 24 of the agenda, it just lists some of the notations that were made. So there are two types of notations. One is about the potential risk and one is about reported incidents. So in 2000, notations were made on 13 properties about the potential risk. In 2001, a further 6 properties had notations made about potential risk. In 2009, 2 properties had notations about actual incidents of flooding, and in 2013 there were 9 additional properties in the area that had notations about the potential risk.
Thank you very much for that. The second question is the thrust of the earlier presentation that was given to us was that we needed to look at the option of whether we bought the properties. And part of the argument was purchasing the flood-prone properties would be a lot cheaper than the engineering options, which is undoubtedly true. But I wanted to get some clarification. Obviously, if you make any decision in relation to purchase of properties that are flood-prone, we'd have to apply the same criteria across the whole region. To be fair, you can't say we'll help people by buying their properties here, but somewhere else where people are being flooded, no, we can't do it. So we need to see the wider context of that. If purchase of individual properties were to be an option, what estimate do you have of the number of properties that we might be required to look at purchasing and what the financial implications, the fiscal implications of that might be. Do you have that information in front of you?
So we just need to check what would we be trying to achieve. So there is a range of risk that is related to properties, and then there is risk related to people in the community being in and around Piha and Glennis Road. So you'd need to really look at what are we trying to achieve, and then you could look at the specific properties you want to achieve that with. So there is no specific what are we trying to achieve at this point. And then you'd have to look at under what circumstances are you willing to look at that for? Is it because of hardship? Is it because of property risk? Is it because of risk to life? So it does very much depend on the intent as to what number of properties you'd specifically be looking at.
I think that's, so just to jump in, I think that's a fair answer. I can see, Mr. Mayor, where your question's coming from, but what I understand in discussions with the staff, and this in no way precludes the discussion happening as part of the consultation, but for the moment, because that hasn't been considered, because we've been looking at flood prevention, purchasing houses doesn't prevent flooding. So that's an individual solution. We've been focusing on community solutions that prevent flooding. So I think your point is well made. However, that would be an individual discussion as we work through the options with the PR community. So I guess the staff won't have the answer to your question because that hasn't necessarily been prepared. But it is obvious that if that discussion comes up in the PR community, that's what we're going to need to look at.
Thank you for that, Madam Chair, and thank you for the answer. I mean, putting yourself in the position of the individual that's been affected by flood, that would be a convenient answer. Putting it from the position of us that would have to apply that rule across everybody, it might be convenient, but it might also be incredibly expensive and prohibitive. If we were to explore that option, we would need that information, Madam Chair.
So just carrying off where the Mayor left off, has there been any work done, Caterina or Paul, with the government about, PR is just a microcosm of what's potentially coming our way, region and nationwide. So is there any work being done to get a thorough understanding for the New Zealand Inc. situation about what we're going to do here, whether we go for some form of earthquake war damages type of nationwide insurance policy, or has that just been left purely to the Crown? Or should we be leading this charge?
So through the chair, in terms of preparing our advice to this, we have spoken to other local authorities that are dealing with comparable issues, and certainly some of the smaller ones, the financial implications are quite significant, and they're having some discussions with the Crown at the moment. And in that regard, we'd also just note, in terms of the Crown's current functions in response to natural hazards, we've got the Earthquake Commission that does provide that, backup support in terms of financial assistance to property owners. So we're looking at it quite broadly and drawing in as many local authorities as we possibly can, because it's a broad issue, and this is really touches upon flooding, but of course there are other natural hazards, coastal inundation in particular, as was mentioned earlier on, that we have to be conscious of.
Thank you. That might be something Mr. Pink could turn his mind to that would be useful to actually work on a Wellington response. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, thanks for your report. I just wanted to pick up on Ms. Kerrigan's presentation, and clearly she was quite emotional about it because it's quite a serious issue to do with your home. And I wanted to pick up on her comments about us being kind of cold and bureaucratic about how we dealt with it. So how can we address that going forward? Like, what is your response to that, please?
So at the community workshop session we had in October, we met each group of residents on an individual basis. At that meeting, the offer was made, and I have made myself available 24/7 since that time to take phone calls at any time. And those of you who know me know that whenever my phone rings, I answer it. And I've had numerous conversations with Mrs. Kerrigan over the last few months in relation to this issue, and I've put myself in her shoes, and I've tried to be as sympathetic as possible, bearing in mind that the issues we're dealing with here are not just issues that relate to the situation as it exists in Glen Esk Road, but if we're going to make decisions, whether it's around purchasing or lifting houses or putting in infrastructure solutions, this is not unique to Glen Esk Road, and as the Mayor has rightly said, we have a number of other situations in Auckland that would need to be taken into account. And so you're in this dilemma. You're balancing the personal situation with what would need to be done as a responsible council officer who's giving advice to councillors on the wise use of ratepayers' money. And that's the conundrum that you're in here, because on the one hand, it's very easy to say, oh, we can sort this out, but the wider regional implications do cause me quite a lot of grief in a sense, because this is really undoing a Pandora's box. What I can say, though, the risk here is, there's no doubt about it, this is one of the biggest risks that we've got because of the nature of the catchment. And that's why we're very concerned about the need to be more proactive around things like early warning, etc., because this can go from nothing to a complete flood in 40 minutes. Piha is an isolated community, therefore we do need to look at how we can be smarter about working with that community to provide that degree of protection at a community level, because there's not time to get external services to that site in a 40-minute time frame. And so that's why some of the early options focus on things like better monitoring, maybe looking at a way of having an enhanced warning system, etc., etc. But I can categorically say that Healthy Waters has not been callous in this issue with the community. We actually do feel for the community, but we are in this conundrum of balancing up those respective needs, if you like.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the response. If I could just add one more extra question. Given that, we're experiencing 100-year event, really heavy rainfall, should we be building on floodplains in the first place?
So there are provisions in the unitary plan that preclude that situation, but I'd have to say, and I'm sure the Chair will back me up here because she was deeply involved in this matter, during the hearings on the unitary plan, there was a lot of pushback from developers who were putting pressure on council to allow for development to occur in flood-prone areas as opposed to floodplain areas. And I think it's something that council is going to need to revisit as part of any update of the unitary plan, because clearly we don't want these situations going forward. And the advice that was given to the people in Glen Esk Road is the advice that the understanding has changed over time, but what I can tell you across the region is that the predicted flood levels that are occurring as a consequence of climate change, the numbers are only getting bigger, and the extent of the floodplains, if you accept the future scenarios around climate change, and that has always been factored into our Healthy Waters modelling, these areas in the region that are both risk of flooding now and flood prone in the future, with a do-nothing scenario, these are only going to get bigger over time.
Ken, if I just, a very quick comment. First of all, I can vouch for the fact that Craig will answer his phone day, night and over the weekends, and I just want to acknowledge the personal commitment you've made to this, Craig. Secondly, and councillors who've been around for a long time will know that our developers loathe the fact that we do put constraints on the ability for them to develop their properties, and one of the most telling cases was the case in the Environment Court of Christchurch versus the developer who did the Bexley development. Christchurch said there will be liquefaction if you build on this. The developer took it to the Environment Court, and we know what happened. Anyone who saw those Bexley houses post the earthquake will know that they were up to their eaves in liquid mud. So sometimes the court doesn't always support council when we say this is a dangerous and difficult thing and it will affect future landowners, often the developers win because we're always seem to be the bad guys covering development and red tape. Sometimes that red tape actually saves lives, and I think we need to hold that in our minds. So thank you, Councillor Bartley, for that really insightful question. We've got a couple of other questions. I've got Councillor Stewart and Member Black.
Thank you for that. Just picking up on what the residents were talking about known council specifications, that the district plan was actually something that was before the unitary plan. That was supposed to be a guide for what was allowed to happen. And one of the things that in recent times that I've seen, especially out in Howick, we've allowed a lot of development to happen in areas that we have known that it's been prone to flood. And really, the question really has to be: can we be liable for allowing this to happen? Because back in 2002 in Manukau, I was instrumental in making sure that a huge part of Howick and Pakuranga had a moratorium over it, where we knew that there was flooding happening. And now, because of the unitary plan, a lot of houses are allowed to be built on these sites. Can you just tell me, do we have some liability to this?
I think, through the chair did partially answer this question when we talk about, so the unitary plan is a legislative process we need to go through. Governing body actually makes final decisions for the council on that. You use your discretion on technical information. People submit and give you feedback, so you will get a mix of people who are very pro, this is too harsh, you're invading my private property rights. You'll get others who are saying it doesn't go far enough. All those decisions are reviewable by the Environment Court. You've heard sometimes the Environment Court overturns those. So when you're in the statutory role, it's about appeal rights through the court, and it's about judicial review of decision making. And that's the same with any decisions you're making through the unitary plan. So it's not really, we don't really use liability words for that. There are appeal rights, there are judicial reviews, people go to the Environment Court. So that is the path when people question the decisions we're making through unitary plans. It is one of the things, though, that we are very careful about, because this is where, if you have a look in the paper, we talk about private property rights. Of course, unitary plan is one of those ways where we can impact on private property rights, and councils are looking very carefully at what they call retreat zoning, particularly as they're looking at future coastal inundation. So that's one of the things we'll be learning about as well, but that is particularly stressful for people who already own and have developed properties. So it's always a balancing act.
Just the unfortunate thing is that a lot of development has been allowed to happen when we've known that it is on flood-prone property, and you do have to feel for a lot of the residents that not everybody can afford to take the council on, or the developers to the Environment Court. So we, as an elected council, really, and the planners really do need to start considering all these things, because it's going to happen more and more often, and we've got people that are living in properties. And I just want to say that Healthy Waters, they do a really wonderful job. They're the ones they're picking up all the ambulance at the bottom. They're picking all the problems up, and it's really that, really, to be perfectly honest, it's really bad planning that we've allowed a lot of this to happen. And now that we actually know that there's a lot of areas of the Auckland region that are prone to flood, really, we should really, even though we've done the unitary plan, we should be really re-looking at the unitary plan and saying we've got to take some of these out. We have to have we have to have some sort of responsibility, because all we're doing is we're inflicting what's just happened to these people behind here onto a lot of other people. And so we really do need to take a stand collectively as a council on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think it will be music to Councillor Darby's ears as Chair of the Planning Committee that you're happy for us to relook at this. However, removing development rights from properties is going to be an interesting battle. I will watch next term from the sidelines and hope that we do some of that. Member Blair.
Kia ora, team. I just wanted to touch on what the Mayor was referring to in terms of precedents and the implications of looking at the PIHA affected residents and how it could create precedents in what we're doing. So I'm just wanting to seek some clarification. Will we be able to see the wider regional implications of flood-prone areas to make an informed decision?
Those maps are actually all publicly available now. If you go onto the council GIS finder and click on floodplains, they're all there. So we're not, all the information that is known by Healthy Waters is out in the public domain. These are macro numbers, but what I can say at the moment, there are 8,000 properties at direct flood risk and another 52,000 properties that are flood prone based on our current knowledge as it exists today. So that puts some sort of context around the regional picture that we're talking about.
Sorry, thank you, Craig. Would that be part of your report that's coming back in June as part of that, or?
So if there was a decision made to purchase or negotiate some acquisition around individual properties, I think the point around the precedent-setting nature of that decision is something that council would have to look at very closely.
Thank you, Member Blair. And as part of our climate change reporting, the up-to-date figures around flood-prone, inundation-prone properties will be available over the next few months. Wayne Walker.
On questions, or are we talking?
Councillor Cooper has signalled that she's happy to move the recommendations, and I'm happy to second them. So if it's going to be a comment,
so
then it's
a comment.
Okay, I've just got Councillor Newman and Councillor Casey with questions, and then we'll go straight to you for comment.
Thank you, Chair. I just wonder, because the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act is now about 15 years old, and I think that there is a similarity between what I'm hearing here and the Waiho River flooding risk assessment in 2003 around the Franz Joseph Glacier. So my question would be, if we have identified that there is a serious level of risk around injury or death in the event of flooding, the first obligation that we have is to publicly advertise that risk at PIHA, isn't it? That is the first obligation that we have. There might be a private property right here, but there is a need to advertise risk to the public around the risk of death or injury at a location subject to flooding and inundation. Would that be reasonable?
So through the chair, yes, in terms of making the community aware in terms of the level of risk, and some of that's taking place under the status quo option. So there has been signage put into that community to notify in terms of what the risk is of flash flooding, and also in terms of council's regulatory role. Those notations on the limbs would also be part of that as well.
Okay, so the next step beyond that would be, okay, if we were to then have a look at the soft solutions for trying to abate hazard risk, that if we were to move beyond that and say, well, that soft solutions alone won't address it, the next tier of intervention needs to be around the public areas, the common areas owned by the council for the community's use. If we were to go down the path of looking at a relocation option, I appreciate this is about abating flood risk, but we would actually have to start with what the council owns, and the common areas that the council is responsible for would actually be the first cab off the rank. Would that be fair?
So through the chair, we would probably describe that as being the second cab off the rank. So the first cab is actually dealing with the flood safety risk and those affected people, those that are at risk, which is why the nature of this report really concentrates on the people. The secondary issue would then be for council to look at its council assets, and we will be bringing back some advice in that regard in the near future.
That's a good question, thank you. Councillor Casey.
I just want to refer to what Sandra said about the tunnel and the dam and the consultation with visitors to Piha. I think what she said resonated with me. If you propose a dam stroke or a tunnel, you'll find that the visitors to Piha are going to be everybody in the North Island who will rise up against it. And I don't know if we want to buy that fight. How are you defining visitor to Piha? So the long list will include that or not? Are you reflecting on what Sandra said?
Just to answer your first question, one of the reasons why these options are very open, you can see that it's early analysis. You can see that we don't understand the full impacts of them on people. You can see that there is no preferred put before this committee or the public, is actually to get a range of views. So I think quite a few people have had different views from different people. I hear all the time, well, that option's not a goer. And then somebody else says, oh, actually, you know, that's the option I want to know about. And so we're just trying at this point to flush the full range of views out. Because sometimes we're hearing all sorts of different views. We've heard views from people who actually think we're going to try and buy up all their properties and force them out of Piha. We've got people who would like to buy properties. We've got people who think the dam and the diversion are terrible options, and yet we've heard, you know, anecdotally people who want to discuss that. We're not assuming actually what people want to talk to us about. We're just trying to put the options we have out there and to hear back. And I'm sure we'll hear quite passionately the options we haven't got, the options people think are crazy, and the options and impacts that people kind of agree with. And that is the point at this point of the resolution, is actually to hear that and gather it in.
Second question then related to how you define visitors to Piha.
So through the chair, we take a very broad definition. So we know that Piha is a destination. People go there for its wild beauty. They go for the beaches and they go for the walking tracks. So what we'll do as part of that engagement is try and talk to those people and maybe some intercept type responses so that we try and get to those people that are visiting that community so that we can try and hear their views.
Just want to speak to the motion, Madam Chair.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Sorry. Councillor Cooper has signalled she wishes to move the recommendation, so let's get the recommendation on the table and then we can speak to it. Did you wish to speak to that as the mover, Councillor Cooper? Okay. All right, then let's go to Councillor.
I just want to speak to the recommendation, and what concerns me is around how we're doing this. And I mentioned earlier the dynamic adaptive pathways approach, which has had a considerable amount of effort applied to it on the part of the Ministry for the Environment. It applies particularly to coastal areas, and I would suggest that there's a great fit here. It deals with issues around scenario, guidance, engagement with communities, how to conduct hazard, risk and voluntary assessments, etc., etc., etc. And I have a real concern that that sort of process is not being used. I've certainly brought it to the attention of various officers around the situation at Orewa Beach, where I think it applies, and I'd suggest it applies here. And picking up on the comments that have been made around precedent, templates effectively, it's really important that where there are processes that are fit for purpose, that are geared to this kind of situation precisely, that we use them where possible. So as much and all as the officers may not be familiar with that, I think it's imperative that we get things right. And I really want to put that question mark over this presentation to us generally. I would hope that the officers are open to that, Madam Chair. Thank you.
All right, that's heard. Anyone else wishing to speak to it? Councillor Newman, did you wish to take your speaking order now? No one else wanting to speak to the recommendations? Okay, Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it is a very complex situation. I think for me, one thing I want to just clear up here, because it may be that people don't know the history. When Project Twin Streams was talked about in terms of dealing with a flooding issue, it was dealt with as a stormwater project that was fully funded by a regional fund. We actually had a plan. We had worked with the community, and it was rolled out in that way. It was fully funded. So it isn't comparable to what we're talking about here. And it worked really well, but it was a plan across the floodplains that were an issue. So I think that's something that has been talked about a lot, but it's not entirely comparable. I'm very happy to see this going out to the community. Piha is a very strong, articulate community that has very strong views, and often they don't agree with each other. So I think this is really important. I have seen on social forums, some people have said, yes, just build this and build that, culverts. So some people will say to us, if we take that option out, why didn't you put that option forward? So I've seen that from some members of the community. I'm not saying it's the right. I have no attachment. I want to hear from this community. And so I think I'm a bit leery to take anything out. I think everybody's got a view on this. Everybody's got different opinions. So we need to test all of those. That's critical. I don't want to be accused of us hiding options, because that could happen too. It is a difficult situation for individuals, but for me, this is about mitigating floods, not about removing people from the situation, because we've got a community that wants to stay there. If we do anything, it's got to be reducing the risk of flooding harm for them. And for some of them, we won't be able to take it all away. That's the issue here. And people have had these notations on their limbs since 2000. So we're looking at 19 years. And so even though it's really difficult for people, we've got to look at this issue as one issue, is about flooding in the area, but the other issue around housing purchases, that's got to be something that personally I don't think is about community consultation, because it's a very personal issue. It's people's assets. It's something that, if it was my house, I wouldn't want my neighbour deciding what was done with it. I'd want to work with my insurance company, possibly EQC and council, to work that out. And so if there is another report around that, I'd like to see that in its own right, because it's very easy to mix the two. So for me, this is the right thing to do with this issue, is to go out to our community, hear what they've got to say. And even if some of the ideas might seem extreme, they are things that some of the community have discussed. So I'm really happy to move this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the community and hearing back what options they see fit for their community. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. I'll put that recommendation. Over, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Thank you to the team who've worked long and hard on this, and I know there is a huge amount of thought going into how to do this well. Thank you to the Kerrigans for being here, and thank you, Greg and Sandra, for your input. I'm going to move that we take a 5-minute adjournment, and we'll be back